The heavy wooden doors of the Poltava City Library slammed so loudly that the echo rolled through the long, empty halls like distant thunder. Margarita flinched. The old lock had jammed again. She adjusted her glasses and peered down the dim corridor. On the threshold stood Hlib, tall, broad-shouldered, wrapped in the same dark jacket he always wore. Rainwater dripped from the hem and formed small dark circles on the stone floor. Outside, October rain fell stubbornly over Poltava, and the smell of wet leaves drifted in with him. His face looked carved from cold stone. Without greeting, he walked straight to the circulation desk, his eyes fixed on it as if he were searching not for a book, but for some hidden exit from the world. Margarita felt herself hold her breath. Whenever he appeared, the calm rhythm of her workday dissolved into something strange and tense. "You're later than usual today," she said quietly, standing from her chair. "I thought the weather might have stopped you halfway." Hlib placed a book wrapped in plastic on the desk and gave a short nod. "Rain doesn't stop work," he replied hoarsely. His voice sounded like someone who had not spoken to another human being for days. "Did you find what I asked for last time?" "The materials about decorative plants in old Poltava estates?" He nodded. Margarita turned and carefully pulled a yellowed folder from a stack behind her. The edges of the paper looked as fragile as dried leaves. "It wasn't easy," she said. "Some pages are almost falling apart. Please be careful. There are descriptions of rose varieties that disappeared after the revolution." For a brief moment, Hlib looked directly at her. Only a few seconds. But Margarita had the strange feeling he was studying her face the same way he studied the ancient atlases he borrowed. Slowly, attentively, as if searching for hidden meaning. He took the folder and moved to his usual table in the far corner near the window. Outside, the street lamp cast a weak orange glow through the thick chestnut branches. Dust floated in the air like pale mist. Margarita watched him from behind the desk. Her life in Poltava had always been quiet, predictable, almost painfully ordinary. She lived with her mother in a small apartment in Levan district, rode the same trolley bus every morning, and spent her days among shelves of books that few people seemed to need anymore. Her mother often complained in the evenings. 32 years old and still alone among dusty shelves, Olena Petrivna would sigh while stirring chamomile tea. Books won't keep you warm forever. Margarita usually pretended not to hear. Yet sometimes, when she glanced toward the corner where Hlib sat silently turning fragile pages, she felt a faint echo of something buried deep inside her. A quiet desire. Not just to be useful as a librarian, but to be necessary to someone as a person. The library grew darker as evening approached. By 6 o'clock, only 2 lamps were still lit in the hall. The smell of old paper mixed with the faint scent of rain that clung to Hlib's jacket. Then the doors opened again. This time the sound was confident, almost careless. Artyom walked in as if the library belonged to him. "Margarita, still hiding here?" he called loudly, ignoring the silence that ruled the building. He wore a polished coat and carried the smell of expensive cologne and cold air. His confident smile looked almost theatrical under the dim lights. "I told you tonight everyone's meeting at the restaurant," he continued, leaning on the desk. "Why are you wasting your life in this museum? Come on, my car's outside." Margarita felt the tension instantly. "Artyom, I work until 8, she said quietly. "Oh, come on," he laughed. "Who even reads books anymore? Internet exists." His gaze slid across the hall and stopped at Hlib. "By the way, who's that gloomy character?" The words fell into the quiet room like stones into still water. From the corner table came the soft sound of a folder closing. Hlib slowly stood up. His movements were calm, precise, but something in the air shifted, and Margarita suddenly realized that the quiet world of her library, this small island of dusty peace, had just begun to crack. For a few seconds no one spoke. Dust drifted lazily in the thin beam of light above the reading tables, and somewhere deep inside the building a radiator clicked softly as it cooled. The silence in the library was not empty. It was tense, stretched tight like a string that might snap at any moment. Artem glanced toward the tall man in the corner again, clearly expecting some reaction. "Did I interrupt something important?" he said with a crooked smile. "Looks like a secret research meeting." Hlib did not answer. He simply slid the fragile folder back onto the table and began gathering his things with slow, careful movements. The gesture itself carried a quiet dignity that made Artem's mocking tone sound even louder. Margarita felt heat rush to her cheeks. "He's a reader," she said firmly, "just like anyone else who comes here." Artem shrugged. "Sure, looks like the cheerful type." He stepped closer to the corner table and glanced at the open pages. "Flowers," he laughed. "You're studying flowers?" Hlib finally raised his eyes. They were darker than Margarita had imagined before, grey with a faint steel blue edge, like a river before a storm. "Yes," he said simply. Artem snorted. "You know, there are easier ways to waste time." Margarita stepped forward quickly. "That's enough, Artem." Her voice was quiet but sharp. "This is a library. People come here to work." For a moment, Artem looked genuinely surprised. Margarita almost never spoke to him like that. In school, she had always been the quiet girl who helped with homework and never argued. But something about the tension in the room had changed her. Artem raised his hands theatrically. All right. No need to defend your mysterious botanist." He leaned closer to her and lowered his voice. "You really should think about your future, Margarita. You're too smart to sit here forever." The smell of his expensive cologne suddenly felt suffocating. "I am thinking about it," she replied. From behind them came the soft scrape of a chair. Hlib had finished packing his papers. He approached the circulation desk and placed the fragile folder carefully in front of Margarita. "Thank you," he said quietly. "I'll return next week." His voice had regained that distant roughness, but now Margarita noticed something else beneath it. Fatigue. Real, bone-deep exhaustion. "You can keep it longer if you need," she said quickly. He hesitated. For a moment it seemed he might refuse. Then he nodded once. Artem watched the exchange with visible irritation. "Well," he muttered, "this place is even stranger than I thought." He turned toward the door. "I'll wait outside, Margarita. 10 minutes." The heavy doors slammed again when he left. Silence returned, but it felt different now. Hlib stood still for a moment, staring at the desk as if considering whether to say something else. "You shouldn't argue with people like him," he said finally. Margarita gave a tired smile. "I've known Artem since school. He's always been like that." "Confident," Hlib said. "That's a polite word for it." For the first time, a faint shadow of amusement passed across his face. Then he pulled his hood over his head and headed for the exit. When the doors closed behind him, the smell of wet earth and autumn leaves lingered in the room. Margarita returned to her chair slowly. Through the tall windows she saw Artem's car waiting by the curb. But the man who occupied her thoughts now was not sitting in that car. It was the quiet stranger who studied forgotten roses as if their roots held the memory of something the world had already lost. And for reasons she could not explain, Margarita suddenly felt that his story was only beginning to grow, like a seed buried deep beneath the soil, waiting for the right moment to break through the earth. The rain continued through the night, tapping softly against Margarita's window like patient fingers. She lay awake long after midnight, staring at the pale ceiling of her small room. Her mother had already gone to sleep in the next room after the usual evening complaints. About prices, about her blood pressure, about Margarita's lonely life. The apartment smelled faintly of chamomile tea and old furniture polish. But Margarita's thoughts were far from the quiet apartment. They kept returning to the tall man in the dark jacket and the strange intensity with which he studied those fragile pages. Flowers, not business plans, not political articles, not the kinds of books people usually rush to borrow. Flowers that no one even grew anymore. The next morning, Poltava woke under a pale sky washed clean by the storm. Puddles reflected the dull silver light, and the air carried the sharp scent of wet earth. When Margarita arrived at the library, she felt an unusual restlessness. She arranged the return books, checked the catalogue, sorted letters on the desk, but her attention kept drifting to the empty corner table near the window. He usually came on Thursdays, but that day he appeared on Wednesday. The heavy door creaked open around noon. Margarita looked up instinctively. Hlib stepped inside, brushing droplets of water from his hair. He looked even more tired than before. There were faint shadows beneath his eyes, and his hands, large, rough hands, were stained with dark soil beneath the nails. He walked to the desk with the same quiet determination. "I hope I'm not disturbing your routine," he said. "Not at all," Margarita replied quickly. She noticed something new then, a thin cut across his knuckles, half-healed but still red. "You hurt your hand." "It's nothing." "Thorns?" she guessed. A faint pause. "Yes." For the first time he allowed himself a small, almost reluctant smile. Margarita reached into the drawer and took out a small first aid kit she kept for paper cuts and splinters. "Give me your hand." "That's not necessary." "It is if you want to keep using it." After a moment of hesitation, he extended his hand across the desk. Up close, she saw how rough his skin was, scratched, weathered, the hands of someone who worked outdoors for hours. When she dabbed the wound with antiseptic, he flinched slightly. "Sorry," she murmured. "I've had worse." "You grow roses, don't you?" she asked quietly. He looked at her with mild surprise. "How did you know?" "Your books, and the soil on your hands." For a few seconds he remained silent. Then he said something he had never said before. "There's an old garden outside the city." His voice softened, as if the words themselves carried weight. "It belonged to my family." "Belonged?" Margarita asked gently. "The house burned during the first months of the war," he said. "After that, everything began to disappear. My mother died last winter." The library suddenly felt very still. "I'm restoring the garden," he continued. "It's the only thing left that still remembers us." Margarita felt something tighten in her chest. "That's why you're searching for those rose varieties?" He nodded. "They grew there once. Rare ones. My grandfather collected them for decades." "And you want them to bloom again?" "Yes." For the first time, his voice carried something warmer than exhaustion. "Some things deserve a second life." Margarita closed the first aid kit slowly. "Then we'll find every book you need." He studied her face again with that careful, searching look. "You say that as if you're part of it." She smiled slightly. "Libraries exist to help people grow things." "What kind of things?" "Sometimes knowledge," she said. "And sometimes hope." Outside the tall windows, the clouds were beginning to break, and thin sunlight slipped through the chestnut leaves. For the first time since he had begun coming to the library, Hlib did not go straight to the corner table. Instead, he remained standing at the desk for a moment longer, as if sensing that something quiet and unexpected had just begun to take root between them. Something fragile, like the first green shoot pushing through cold autumn soil. For the next few weeks, the rhythm of the library changed in ways Margarita could not easily explain. Hlib began appearing more often. Sometimes he came early in the morning when the building was still half asleep and the smell of cleaning soap lingered between the shelves. Sometimes he arrived near closing time, bringing with him the cold breath of evening fields and the faint scent of damp soil. Always the same dark jacket, always the quiet nod. Yet something between them had shifted after that small moment with the bandaged hand. He spoke more now. Not much. Hlib was clearly a man who carried his thoughts carefully, but enough for Margarita to begin seeing fragments of the world he came from. He told her about the old orchard beyond the garden where wild apples still grew crooked and bitter, about the broken well behind the house, about the long rows of roses his grandfather had planted decades ago. They had names no one remembers anymore, he said one evening while studying a faded botanical atlas. Some came from old Polish estates, some from French nurseries that disappeared before the war. "And you think they might still survive?" Margarita asked. "Roses are stubborn," he replied quietly. "Their roots go deeper than people think." Margarita smiled at that. The library windows glowed softly in the early darkness. Outside, streetlights flickered on, painting pale circles on the wet pavement. Only a few readers remained. The silence between the shelves had become familiar again, comfortable now, almost warm. Then the doors opened sharply. The sound broke the calm like a stone thrown into water. Margarita looked up. A woman stood in the entrance. She was elegant in a way that seemed almost unnatural in the dusty old building. Long wool coat, leather gloves, dark glasses pushed into perfectly styled hair. The scent of expensive perfume drifted ahead of her like a sharp breeze. Her eyes scanned the room quickly, then they stopped on Hlib. "Well," she said, her voice smooth but edged with something cold. "So this is where you disappeared?" Hlib froze. The pencil in his hand stopped moving across the paper. "Hello, Inna," he said quietly without turning around. Margarita felt the temperature in the room drop. The woman walked slowly between the tables, her heels clicking softly on the floor. "I've been looking for you all over the region," she continued, "and you're hiding in a library." "I'm not hiding." "No?" She laughed softly. "Because selling your apartment and running off to play gardener certainly looks like hiding." The few remaining readers began glancing nervously toward them. Margarita stepped from behind the desk. "Excuse me," she said politely but firmly. "Conversations should be quiet here." Inna turned toward her with mild curiosity, as if noticing a piece of furniture. "And you are?" "The librarian." Inna's gaze lingered on Margarita for a moment longer than necessary. Then she smiled, a thin smile that did not reach her eyes. "So you're the one encouraging this madness." "No one encourages me," Hlib said calmly. Inna ignored him. "Do you know," she said lightly to Margarita, "that this man once ran one of the most successful landscape studios in Kiev?" Margarita blinked. She looked at Hlib. He had never mentioned that. "People trusted him with estates worth millions," Inna continued. "Hotels, corporate parks, even foreign clients. And now," she gestured around the room with theatrical amusement, "he studies dead roses in dusty books." The words hung in the air like frost. Hlib finally closed the atlas. "They're not dead," he said quietly. "Oh, please. They're waiting." Something in his voice made Margarita's chest tighten. Inna studied him carefully. "You really believe that, don't you?" "Yes." The woman sighed impatiently. "Hlib, listen to yourself. You've buried your money in land that produces nothing." it produces life. It produces depths, her tone sharpened. You owe investors, you owe contractors, and now you owe me. Margarita felt a sudden chill. You bought the debt, Hlib said calmly. Inna's smile returned. Of course I did. For the first time, her eyes flickered toward Margarita again. You see, she said softly, romantic dreams are very expensive things. The library fell completely silent, and Margarita suddenly realized that the quiet story she had stepped into, the one about forgotten roses and a ruined garden, was much larger and more dangerous than she had ever imagined. For a moment, no one in the library moved. Even the quiet rustling of pages had stopped. The few readers who remained sat frozen behind their books, pretending not to listen while hearing every word. Margarita felt her pulse beating in her ears. Hlib remained seated, his hands resting on the old atlas, as if the fragile paper beneath his fingers anchored him to something stronger than the conversation unfolding around him. Inna removed her gloves slowly, one finger at a time. You always had this ridiculous sense of heroism, she said calmly, saving dying gardens, restoring forgotten parks, rescuing history from oblivion. Her voice carried the polished confidence of someone used to winning arguments before they even began. But reality is less poetic, she continued. Reality involves numbers. Hlib finally stood. He was taller than her by nearly a head, yet there was no aggression in his posture, only a quiet steadiness. You didn't come here to discuss numbers. No, she admitted. I came to give you one last chance. The words echoed faintly between the shells. A chance for what? Margarita asked before she could stop herself. Inna turned her head slightly, surprised that the librarian had spoken. To end this nonsense, she replied coolly. The land your precious garden sits on is legally tied to a loan. A loan Hlib cannot repay. That's temporary, Hlib said. Inna laughed softly. Temporary? You sold your apartment to buy seedlings. You refused 3 contracts in Kiev, and you continue pouring money into a patch of dirt that grows flowers no one will ever buy. They're not for sale. That's exactly the problem. Margarita watched them both carefully. She could see now that Inna's anger was not only about money. There was something sharper beneath it, something personal. You don't understand, Hlib said quietly. Then explain it. The garden survived 2 wars, he replied. My grandfather planted roses there when the world was collapsing around him. My mother kept them alive when everyone else left. He paused. If I abandon it now, then everything they protected disappears. Inna's eyes narrowed. You always loved ghosts more than living people. That's not true. No, she said coldly. Because it certainly felt that way during our marriage. The word hung in the air like broken glass. Marriage. Margarita felt a small jolt of surprise. Hlib did not react. Inna turned away from him and began walking slowly around the reading table, trailing her fingers along the polished wood. I try to build a future with you, she said. A real one, with stability, investments, growth. You try to turn everything into profit. That's how the world works. Not everything has a price. Inna stopped walking. For the first time, her expression hardened completely. Everything has a price. She reached into her handbag and placed a folder on the table. The bank transferred the debt to me yesterday. Hlib looked at the folder but did not touch it. What does that mean? Margarita asked quietly. It means, Inna said, that the land belongs to the creditor. Her gaze settled calmly on Hlib. And now the creditor is me. The silence that followed seemed to stretch endlessly. Inna, Hlib began. You have 30 days, she interrupted. To do what? To repay the entire amount. And if I can't? Inna closed the clasp of her handbag with a soft click. Then the garden becomes my property. Margarita felt a cold wave pass through her. "And what will you do with it?" she asked. Inna gave a small, almost amused smile. "The land is close to the highway. Investors are already interested." "A shopping complex," Hlib said quietly. "Exactly." The word echoed through the library like a verdict. Hlib said nothing, but Margarita noticed the way his hand tightened around the edge of the table. Inna glanced at her watch. "Well," she said lightly, "I've said everything I came to say." She turned toward the exit, then paused beside Margarita. "You seem like an intelligent woman," she said softly. "Don't waste your life defending impossible dreams." Her heels clicked steadily across the floor. The doors opened, closed, and the library returned to silence. But now the quiet felt different, heavier. Hlib remained standing for a long moment, staring at the folder lying on the table. Finally, he exhaled slowly. "I'm sorry you had to witness that." Margarita shook her head. "What will you do?" He looked toward the window, where the evening sky had begun turning dark blue. "I don't know," he admitted. Then he added quietly, "But I won't let the garden die." Margarita studied his tired face, the stubborn calm in his voice, the soil still trapped beneath his fingernails. And in that moment she understood something clearly. The story of the forgotten roses had reached the point where roots either break or grow deeper than anyone expected. The library closed that evening in unusual silence. Margarita switched off the lamps one by one, moving slowly through the long aisles. Shadows stretched across the shelves, and the familiar smell of old paper wrapped around her like a memory she was not ready to lose. At the circulation desk, the folder Ina had left still lay where Hlib had not touched it. He stood near the window, looking out at the quiet street where rain had begun again, thin silver threads sliding down the glass. 30 days, Margarita said softly. "Yes. And the debt, it's really that large?" Hlib nodded once. "For someone with my current income, impossible." He said it without bitterness, simply as a fact. Margarita studied him carefully. The tiredness in his eyes was deeper now, but something else was there too. The same stubborn calm she had seen when he spoke about the roses. "You won't sell the garden," she said. "No. Even if you lose everything else." He turned toward her. "I already lost almost everything once," he replied quietly. "The garden is the last piece that still remembers who we were." Margarita felt those words settle somewhere deep inside her chest. She walked to the desk, picked up the folder, and looked at the neat printed pages inside. Contracts, loan documents, legal stamps. Cold official proof that dreams could be measured in numbers. "Do you know something?" she said after a moment. "What?" "Libraries keep more than books." Hlib frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" "They keep memory." She began gathering a stack of old botanical atlases from the nearby shelf. "Earlier today I found something interesting in the archives," she continued. "Records from the 19th century. Estate maps, agricultural surveys." Hlib stepped closer. "And? The garden you are restoring isn't just a private plot of land." She opened one of the atlases and turned it toward him. A faded map spread across the yellowed page, covered in careful handwriting. "It was part of an experimental botanical station," Margarita explained, "one of the earliest in this region." Hlib stared at the map. His fingers traced the thin ink lines marking rows of plants. "My grandfather used to mention something like that," he murmured. "If the garden still contains original plant lines," Margarita said slowly, "it could qualify as protected cultural heritage." Hlib looked up sharply. "That would stop commercial construction." "Yes, but proving that would take months." "Maybe," she said, "or maybe not." The rain outside intensified, tapping urgently against the windows. Margarita closed the atlas. "You said roses are stubborn," she continued. "Their roots go deep." "Yes." "Well," she said with a small smile, "so do stories." For the first time since Inna had left, something like hope flickered across Hlib's face. "You'd help me with this?" Margarita looked around the quiet library, the place where she had spent most of her adult life hiding from the larger world. Perhaps, she thought, it was time for the books to step outside. "Yes," she said. They stood there for a moment, two people surrounded by shelves filled with centuries of forgotten knowledge. Outside, the rain softened. "Come tomorrow," Margarita added. "Bring any records your family kept. Letters, notebooks, photographs." Hlib nodded slowly. "I will." He hesitated near the door before leaving. "Thank you," he said quietly. "For what?" "For believing that something old can still bloom." When he stepped out into the rainy night, the faint smell of wet soil followed him again. Margarita remained inside for a moment longer. Through the window, she watched him walk down the dark street, tall, solitary, stubborn. A man protecting a garden no one else seemed to care about. She did not know yet how difficult the next weeks would be. She did not know about the arguments, the long nights in dusty archives, or the fight that awaited them beyond the quiet walls of the library. But one thought stayed with her as she locked the door. Real love, she realized, does not begin with grand confessions. It begins quietly, like roots beneath the earth, invisible at first, until one day something living pushes through the soil and reaches for the light.